So hi everyone, my name is John Coughlin. I'm on the community relations team with GitLab, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. Prior to kind of the outbreak of COVID and the pandemic, we were really focused on in-person events. And so being in New York with meetup groups around the world, I never really got to participate in GitLab meetups. And now kind of being forced to do more virtual events because of the pandemic. One of the silver linings has been that I've actually gotten to attend a lot more GitLab meetups and spend a lot more time with the community. And I'm really excited to be meeting with what I expect will be a kind of largely Australian APAC audience, given the time zone. But it's really cool to connect with the global community. So thanks for letting me be with you today. I shared in the Zoom chat, which you can open by clicking the little chat bubble on the bottom, a link to the GitLab Code of Conduct. I'd ask that everybody, just do their best to ensure that this is like a welcoming and inclusive environment. And if anyone feels kind of threatened or has any concerns, you can use that Zoom chat box to send me a private message, and I'll work with you to resolve any concerns or remove people from the meeting if we need to. But we haven't had to do that yet, and I don't anticipate that happening, but we do like to talk about it. So what is GitLab? For folks that don't know too much about GitLab, it's a complete kind of DevOps platform delivered as a single application. There's one interface, one conversation, one permission model, thousands of features. I saw something today that we've delivered over 1,900 features in the last 3 years, which is pretty unbelievable. And we have our big 13.0 release coming up next, so I'm sure there'll be more on the way. GitLab's an open core company, so we do have like a core product that's free and open source for people to use. And then we also have different kind of enterprise tiers for bigger teams and bigger organizations that need kind of different features than a smaller team or an open source project, a smaller open source project might need. At GitLab, we believe everyone can contribute. So if you are kind of an open source contributor, we'd love to have you in our community. And we have lots of great information about that on the community page of our website. Some other cool things about GitLab, which I'm sure you'll be hearing about more from Jessica. We're the largest all remote company in the world, which is really exciting. And for folks that are new to remote work, I think we have a lot of great knowledge to share. And I'm sure that's why many of you are here today. And then the other thing I always like to talk about is our transparency. We're one of the most transparent companies in the world, maybe the most. I don't know if you know of a company that's more transparent, let me know. But everything we do, our handbook, our roadmaps, our strategy, our financials, like a lot of our meetings, are all publicly available either in our the GitLab handbook or on our website or on YouTube. So you can go and dig into that if you're interested. The agenda for tonight is going to be a presentation on asynchronous communication, and then we encourage folks to stick around, just for casual conversation after. And I think Jessica said she might have a prompt to kind of stir some of that, so I'm excited to hear what that is. And then as I mentioned earlier, it'd be great to have folks have their cameras on, engage in the chat. Try to close like the other tabs, maybe turn off your Slack notifications and just be present for this. I feel like you all deserve a break. So just enjoy the time that we have together. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica.
Okay, so hi everybody. I am Jessica Reeder. I am the integrated campaign manager for all remote at GitLab. So specifically focusing on communicating about remote work, which is a very hot topic right now. And I'm very excited to see how many people are here. So welcome and thanks for being here. I want to just kick it straight off, but before I do, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. I love participating. I may not answer your question right away, but I'd love to get to it at the end. So feel free to just drop them in at any time. And I'm going to ask you for a couple of responses in the chat as well. So use that chat button down at the bottom to start messaging in the side, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. Okay, let's start with a definition. So here's my fancy slides today. Asynchronous. Is this backwards? Let's turn my video around. 1 second.
It looks good.
Oh yeah, you can see it?
Yep.
Oh good. Asynchronous. It means out of time or out of sync. So it's usually more of a development term. This describes a process where a server or a program can receive or transmit information at any time without operating on a schedule. So recently people are talking more about asynchronous communication. It's more or less the same thing, but not exactly. So async communication is when a message can be sent at any time and it can be read at any time. That's the simplest way to look at it. So if we think about some examples of async communication, human history is actually full of them. So the one that I used in the talk description today was cave paintings. So painting in caves is about the oldest known human form of asynchronous communication. And given that we're still able to read those messages thousands and thousands of years later, I would say it's a very highly effective form of async communication. So what else? What are some other forms of async? Can you drop them in the chat along with everybody's locations? What's another form of asynchronous communication? Something that we use now, something that we've used in the past? I'll give you an example again. Text messages, that's a great one. Email, asynchronous communication. What else? Mail drops. Voicemail, that's a good one. Slack messages, Jira comments, totally. Podcasting, carrier pigeon, video, Mattermost, totally. Okay, so these are all great examples. So when we're talking about async communication, realistically, it could happen in almost any format, and it's something that humans have been doing almost forever. So let's go back a step and just go back to definitions, because the other part of this is communication. So I defined asynchronous, but how often do we really think about what is the definition of communication? It seems obvious, but let's take just a minute and define it. So if you think you have a great definition for communication, write it in the chat. And while you work on that, I will tell you a story. So I've got a good friend. His name is Thomas, and we are friends in real life. We've been friends for years and years and years, and we are also connected on every social media platform. So last week, I decided I wanted to send Thomas a message. So I opened my Twitter DMs, and what did I find? I found the last message between me and Thomas, which was from 2009. And even worse, this was a message where Thomas was writing to me to ask, what time does the barbecue start? In May of 2009. So obviously I missed it, and he was trying to get in touch with me, and I never responded back. I don't even remember if there was a barbecue in May 2009. Apparently there was. 11 years later, any guess as to what the first word of my response to him was? It was sorry. Or it might have been whoops, sorry. But the most important thing was that even after all that time, I had to admit that I had messed up. So the technical definition of communication is exactly what John wrote in the chat. It's the way that people share information. But I like to add a little bit to it. Because we're humans and we have feelings, I define it as communication is sharing information and emotion. So when we communicate synchronously in real time, like we're doing right now, we can sort of read the response, right? You can watch people's body language, you can watch their facial expressions, and if I say something that really bothers you, I can usually perceive that, and then I can apologize. When we communicate async, we don't have that immediate emotional feedback. So async communication isn't just getting the information from one place to another, it's also communicating in a way that helps everybody feel good about the exchange, and then closing that loop by sharing the feedback so we can continue to do better going forward. So I joined GitLab just a month and a half ago, so I'm very new, but I've been working remotely for my whole career. So what I want to do today is go over the key principles of communication that I've learned over my career, and then I'll also talk about what GitLab does that corresponds to that, what their approaches are, what our approaches are, and then some problems you can avoid and tactics you can use to communicate more effectively in an async environment. Okay, so the first key principle that I want to share with you, document everything in a central location. If this is backwards, we'll deal with it later. Good. So I'm sure everybody here has had this experience. So it's deadline. You have hours to get something done. It's the middle of the night. Nobody's online, so you can't ask anybody any questions, and you cannot find the information that you need. So you then go searching through email chains, right? You're trying to find that one message where somebody might have said the thing that you need to know. Panic situation, right? Communication about work has one goal, which is to get the work done. If you're communicating without documenting, you eventually run into a situation where the work can't be done because the information can't be found. And that's not your fault when that happens. What it means is that the system isn't working. So think of your documentation as a form of communication. It's really useful in an asynchronous team especially. Doesn't matter how you document things. You might use text documents, GDocs, spreadsheets, project management tools, whatever your team wants to do. Just don't bury the important information in message chains. That's where I keep all my gifts personally. So you may have heard this term, single source of truth, SSOT. It's a beautiful term. I love this term because it really expresses exactly what you need. One source of truth for where the information lives. Think about how you can create that single source of truth wherever you want to put it. And then think about how you can get people to use it and keep it up to date. So think about that for just a second. GitLab has an interesting approach to this. I have never seen this done before. So like many teams at GitLab, we use a project management tool. In this case, it's GitLab. And we use that for work. And for everything that needs to be common knowledge, we add it to the company handbook, which is public. So I'm going to share the link to it right now. That's our single source of truth. But like many teams, we also use Slack for chat. And when you have a chat tool, it's super easy to just start doing work there instead of using your single source of truth. But here's the twist. GitLab has its Slack set so that all messages are deleted after 90 days. Imagine that, they're gone. No way to find them again, and it becomes a forcing function. You're forced to use the single source of truth because if you don't, you know that your information will eventually disappear. It's actually really helpful for people to do that, and it ends up enforcing much better communication practices. Okay. Next key communication principle. Send more information with fewer pings. So the other day, I got a message from a coworker. I'm going to use this as an example that it actually is a coworker that I work beautifully with. Communication problems can happen between very close teammates. She was in a hurry and she sent me a quick message, and the message said, "Can you respond to Shane's question?" And my response to her was, "What question? Where do I find it? Respond how?" But she wasn't online. So I sent her my questions, but then I had to wait and find out what she was talking about. In the meantime, I went looking, and eventually after some time, I found the question that she was talking about and I responded, and then I had to message her again and say, "Oh, sorry, I found it." So how could that exchange have been more efficient? Plenty of ways, but straight up front, she could have said, "There's a post from Shane in the all remote Slack channel from a few hours ago. Can you respond with your availability for a call?" That would have taken a little bit longer to type, but the whole process would have moved forward more efficiently, and that's going to help the entire team. So there's a concept in communication, and it's called context. It roughly means how much information you assume the other person has about what you're discussing. I'm sharing a Wikipedia page, a little bit about context there. It's a little bit difficult to wrap your mind around this, but here's how it goes. If it's a high context communication, you're assuming that the other person has a lot of knowledge. So if I'm talking to you all right now and I say, we are in a GitLab remote work virtual meetup taking place on Zoom, everyone here knows what GitLab is. We know what remote work is. We know what a meetup is, and we know what Zoom is. So those are all terms like jargon and slang and business terms that some people understand what they are and others don't and would have to have them defined. So that's high context communication. Low context communication is when you assume that the other person doesn't have the full picture. So you tell them everything that they might need to know. So the original message my coworker sent was high context. Can you respond to Shane's question? But it would have been more effective as low context. There's two big reasons that we use low context information in remote work. First of all, as I just explained, it's way more efficient. So if we had had that conversation with a little bit more information delivered, then it would have been much more efficient in the long run for the team. So if it's async, if anybody has follow-up questions, you're causing a delay. But the second reason to use low context communication is that if you are not interacting face-to-face, you can't use gestures and facial expressions to make sure the communication is being received well. So let me ask you, when you get a message that asks you to do something and doesn't give you the information you need to do it, how do you feel? Post your answers in the chat if you have them. How do you feel when someone asks you to do something and does not give you the information that you need to do it? And then when I replied with, what message? How do I find it? How should I respond? How do you think my coworker felt about that? Sigh, yeah, frustrated, confused, irritated, condescended to, blocked, all negative stuff, right? Left in the dark, totally. There's no need for that to happen. And there's also no need for us to be over communicating, messaging each other all day long with little pieces of information. Instead, it's hard to do, but if you really make an effort to make your communication super efficient and give the full information in every message, you save time, you do just as much work without getting in each other's way, and you improve the emotional balance. So let's talk about the emotional part next, because when it comes to communication, it always comes back to emotion. So the next concept that I want to share with you is my favorite. Be kind and gracious. We are not machines. We have emotions. And unfortunately, we use the same communication system, language, to communicate and share our emotions right alongside the good information. So it's very important that even if you're having a negative emotional reaction to something that you heard or read, you have to do your best to treat people with kindness in return. Remember, the other person probably doesn't have the same information as you do. They might not have the same cultural or business background as you have. And most importantly, they probably didn't mean to hurt your feelings. So GitLab actually states this beautifully. So this is one of the best ways that I've seen this written. So I wrote this down as well. Assume positive intent. Always assume that the other person meant it well. It's a simple idea, but it's really hard to do. You have to take the message and reprocess it, try to figure out their intent. And even if you can't, you have to still respond with that kindness and respect. So this is the most difficult thing I think that a lot of us are faced with in our day-to-day lives. So I want everybody here to think about a time recently when you had a communication with somebody that didn't go very well. I'm going to ask you to share these. This is the prompt for discussion groups later. So think about something that happened in your professional life instead of your personal life, because I want you to feel comfortable responding or discussing it in a business context. But think about those a little bit. Start writing down some answers now, and we're going to come back to it a little bit later. Now let's go back to my exchange. So the one I was telling you about earlier, where me and my coworker were sharing messages. And when I got her message, I said, what question, where, how do I respond? If I had taken a little extra time on my side to communicate with kindness, I might have said something more like, sure, I'll go look for that question and try to respond. But if you can give me a little more context, I can probably handle this faster. It takes more time to do that. Our instinct with communication is to respond fast. And that's mostly because most of our lives, we are communicating synchronously in real time. But when it's async, it slows down. And that means you can slow down your reactions, slow down the pace, and it allows you to take time and respond in the kindest way possible. Okay, so I have one more principle that I want to share. This is the last one that I think is extremely important. Make time for informal communication. So we're all busy and we're all working hard and we're trying to be efficient and do the best communication we can. We're trying to not spam each other. So when is it appropriate to tell people that it's your birthday? When is it appropriate to tell people that you watched the entire series of Tiger King over the weekend, or that your kid created a beautiful piece of artwork? The answer is you have to make that time. There's no hallway chatter. You can't run into people and tell them. There's no water cooler. Nobody's going to appreciate your new shoes. And over time, all of this lack of informal communication means that it becomes too easy to default to only formal interactions. When we never share the things that make us human, we don't get to know each other. We don't feel seen. We don't feel included. My manager and I meet every week, and the first item on our agenda is life. We have to think of something from our personal lives to share, even during the quarantine. It's important to both of us. We have to connect as human beings for just a few minutes before we get into the work talk, and it makes a big difference. So one thing that GitLab does is they have coffee chats. I love this. So this is where you can schedule 30 minutes with anybody to talk about anything, but hopefully it's not work. Those are great. We also have happy hour calls. We have trivia competitions, talent shows, which actually I remember John's family did a wonderful job on. And we also have celebrations just of birthdays, anniversaries, whatever it is. If you want to read more about that, I'm actually going to share a link in the chat right now, and it has some extra ideas about informal communication. So this is from the GitLab website. Those are my 4 key principles. I'm going to reiterate them in just a minute, but I want to also mention that they do closely align with GitLab principles, and that's part of why I was so excited to come and work for this company. They've been remote since the beginning. It is the world's largest remote company, and they get it. And that makes a big difference. After you've been working remotely for a long time, these issues become crucial to your enjoyment of your work life. So building a strong remote culture involves building strong remote communication and strong async communication. I'm also going to share a link in the chat now, and this is another article that I love about GitLab's recommendations for async communication. And while I've been sharing with you my personal preferences, I'm going to touch on a couple of things that are in that link that I didn't share here. So one thing that I love from that link is removing any bias toward a specific time zone. This is huge for global remote teams. So this event right now, some of y'all are Thursday morning, and I am calling from Wednesday night, right, in the US. That's something that a lot of companies would not necessarily feel comfortable doing. Even if they're working remotely, they're fixated on one time zone. So switching to that rolling schedule makes it much more inclusive on a global basis. It's hard to do. I wouldn't say that anyone does it perfectly, but it's really cool that the intent is there. Another thing mentioned in that link is autonomy. So it's the ability for each person to do what they think is right in the moment without waiting for permission. I love this. This is a big one for keeping the work flowing in an asynchronous team. It's also really good for everyone's ego and their job satisfaction, because if you know what needs to be done, then you can just go do it and tell people that you did it, and then they can change it later if they need to. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this is how asynchronous communication can break down. So I'm going to put in the chat the 4 principles that I just talked about. So document everything in a central location, communicate more information with fewer pings, be kind and gracious, and make time for informal communication. So then, if that's what makes it work, what makes asynchronous communication fail? If you have some ideas, I would love to see them in the chat. I will share some too. What can make asynchronous communication fail? Too many messages. Ding, exactly right. Expectations of quick responses, absolutely. Lack of context, absolutely. Lack of expectations in general, very much so. No reading, no priority placed on reading the documentation. Yeah, that's a tough one. The handbook is great for that. Opening a question in chat with, hi, how are you? And then waiting for the real question to be formulated. Oh, I've experienced this so many times in my life. That's spot on. Missing or excluding your target audience. Huge one. Not understanding what your people you're communicating with need to know or want to hear. Excellent. A few other ones. If people don't share enough information, or if they spam each other with small pieces of information. If there's only time ever for meetings and work talk and never any personal connection. Yeah, making sure everyone who feels included or who should be involved, or the converse, it can break it by not including the people who should be involved. Excellent. And that's it. This brings me to the end of me being the only person talking. So thanks for everyone with your ideas here. I want to set aside a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you have questions, you can either come off mute and verbalize them, or you can drop them in the chat. Try to stump me. I will be happy to answer any questions. And then remember that for the breakout discussions, I have a prompt for you, which is sharing a time when a communication didn't go well, and then see if you can think about how to make it go better. So any questions?
Hey, I'll ask a question, even though I could probably corner you sometime over Slack to ask, but curious, like what's, for folks that are just getting started, you know, working remotely, like where should they start?
For just getting started working remotely?
Like for teams that are just kind of new to remote, like, you know, I think the single source of truth is great. Obviously, assuming positive intent is probably like a lower lift than launching
Yeah.
a handbook, you know.
Yeah.
Just curious, like what's kind of the recommendation for how people can get started adopting these best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. It is so hard to get started when the whole world is out there and you don't know exactly what direction to go in. I would say the best thing to do is find the right tools for what you want to do. So figure out what is going to be our single source of truth. What is going to work best for my team? What's our best communication tool? And then start documenting. I think that's the most important thing you can do, is make sure that everyone has access to that same information. And then next you need to figure out what your values are. So these are great communication principles, but how does it work for people to give each other feedback? What are good, you know, working hours? How are meetings handled? Think about all those logistics for your team so that they can get started. There is an excellent remote work playbook that I'm going to share with you, and it covers a lot of this. And we also have a guide to going remote for the very first time, or going remote in an emergency situation, which for some of us is happening right now. So let me just share this right now. If you go to this page, there's a playbook you can download that has a lot of these tips for the very beginning. And then all of the remote work information that we've published at GitLab is also available on this page. So it's a long answer to say that the best thing you can do is start documenting and think about what you can do to help your team communicate.
Hi, I suppose I've got a question about deduplication. A lot of times if your single source of truth is something like ServiceNow, people might raise the same issue numerous times and your single source of truth tends to be multiple tickets. How could that be handled in all sorts of scenarios, Confluence, Jira?
Yeah, that is a familiar situation. I know exactly what you're talking about. And this happens at GitLab. It happens in every organization. As soon as you have people, you introduce complexity, right? So yes, multiple issues will be spun up on the exact same topic. And so what is the most important thing you can do to handle that is to have a DRI. A DRI is a directly responsible individual who handles everything on a certain subject. And that person can make sure that they are capturing all of the issues that might otherwise be duplicates, merging them into one source of thought. So generally having subject matter experts that are covering different parts of your communications, of your information, that helps to clean up the documentation. It is not a perfect process. And so the second part of that is that everybody needs to be responsible. So it's important to think about it. The GitLab philosophy is that everyone can contribute. And that means also that everyone is responsible for contributing. So if you see a problem, you don't just let it pass you by. You flag it, find out if it's a known issue, and then handle it. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
So how do you handle it when people have different styles of communication? Does that go through the one person who's in charge of that documentation, or to see if something gets misunderstood in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you're talking about different styles of communication, do you mean like some people prefer to write and some people prefer to have a video call? Or are you talking about some people are more forceful and some people are more reticent, let's say?
A little bit of both, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, because some people do prefer, talking it out and getting it out that way, while other people prefer to write. But myself, I don't mind writing, but I tend to be more brief than some other people seem to like. But I think I'm getting everything in there, and I do seem to when I look at their end product. But they put more words around, more flowery words around the isolated stuff that I tend to put out.
Yeah, this is an eternal question, and you can never really correct for that. It is never going to be perfect, and that's why it comes back to that: assume positive intent and be kind and gracious. Because ultimately, even though we've been using human communication for all of humanity, we still kind of suck at it sometimes. And sometimes you just really can't fix that. But what you can do is fix your response to it. That said, it helps to have some documentation of what the best practices are for your team. So the team leadership, and this is from the executive level on down, should really decide what are the best practices. So when is it appropriate to have this as a text conversation? When does it need to be moved to a video conversation? We have specific rules about this at GitLab. If we need to check in more than 3 times about something over text, then we have a call. So you can get really specific about that. And then if people are giving you feedback that your communication isn't being received too well, don't be afraid to receive that feedback and just receive it with kindness and say, thank you for that. I'll try to do this. And then if you can also try to listen to me better, that's how you start to sort of smooth out those relationships. Again, it's never going to be perfect, but if we keep going about it with kindness, then we eventually get to a good place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and some people just prefer to listen opposed to reading. I prefer to read as opposed to listening. Any other questions? All right then. Well, thank you all for being here. Those are great questions as well. And thank you for the participation. It was wonderful. You guys came up with some really good stuff. So you've got the prompt, and then I would urge everyone to take these 4 principles. I'm going to put them in the chat one more time. Copy it, and then you can paste it into your group chat in the breakout rooms if you need to use it.
Before we go into the breakout rooms, I did want to ask, this is something kind of cheesy that we do at every meetup, but if everyone could unmute and give Jessica a round of applause for her session, that would be great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's
Jessica.
very kind. That's very kind.
And yeah, could you just repeat the prompt also for folks like me that might have forgotten?
Yes, I will. Think about a time in recent history in your professional life when you had a communication that did not go well. So any difficult communication you've had recently, and then be ready to share it with the group, and maybe you can discuss how it could have gone better.